This video will teach you how to write an expository paper for a philosophy course. First of all, what does exposition mean? Exposition means you are explaining something from a text, in particular, an idea or a theory. You're supposed to give a comprehensive explanation with an exposition. It's more than just quoting the text or giving a general summary of it. It means you're going into depth and detail and trying to reconstruct the argument for someone who has never read the text before. So the most important thing in an exposition is to give a close reading of the argument or idea. The goal of your essay is to explain what the philosopher says in depth and detail. So you will be reconstructing the argument by paraphrasing and quoting specific passages. That means you have to go back to the text and locate where the important parts are for your paper. Make sure you're picking important quotations. Don't pick long quotations. That ends up being a way of using the text instead of summarizing ideas in your own words. Instead, you want to just look at quotations that are really important, short and sweet, and they summarize the idea in a way that you couldn't quite put into your own words. You also want to be able to expand on the quotation with your own explanations. So make sure that you always set up the quotation and then afterwards unpack the quotation in your own words. Make sure you draw attention to word choice, that you draw connections between particular ideas and other parts of the text. You might need to give some context because you're trying to reconstruct the entire argument. So make sure you understand how that particular idea fits into the larger picture of what the philosopher is trying to do. Make sure you're presenting it in a way that is precise and accurate, and you're not shifting the meaning or representing it in a way that is unfair. So this means that before you go to write your paper, you have to review the text very carefully and digest the ideas. Part of writing a paper is reviewing and brainstorming. Make sure you review what you already know before you go to write the paper. You can rewatch video lectures. You can also study the notes you've taken. But since you're going to be writing a paper and giving an exposition, you also want to go back and reread the text. It's a good idea to print it out so that you can read it more carefully. You can highlight sentences that explain main points, write marginal notes, do whatever you can to actively read the text and work through it very carefully. After you're done rereading, map out the ideas that you're going to use for your paper. Make sure you're writing down main points and look for important connections or things that you can elaborate on. For every point you write down, think about how you would explain it to someone who has never read that text or even studied philosophy before. Sometimes examples can be helpful for illustrating ideas. So try to think about either real-world examples or something that supports the idea and fleshes it out. As you're doing this, ask yourself how, why, and so what questions. If you say that the philosopher makes a particular point, how do they make that point? Why do they make that point? And why does it matter? After you've brainstormed, start to think about the thesis statement for your paper. Make sure that it's specific. If it's too broad and vague, it's not going to be very good for a paper. It will just end up being too much that you can cover. If it's not unified, it will also not be a good thesis for your paper because it will seem like you're writing 2 or 3 papers instead of 1. Make sure that the main point is really unified and that you're not trying to make too many points in your thesis. It should also be expository since this is an expository paper. Note that exposition is about analyzing an idea, so you don't want to take a point that is completely self-evident and obvious. Anyone who's read the text will come to that conclusion. You want to have a little bit more original insight. You are explaining the philosopher's idea or argument, but you also need to show some originality in how you present it. So your exposition should kind of give us a sense of why the idea matters or how this paper will address it in a significant way. After you have a good thesis statement, break your thesis into parts. This helps you figure out how your paper will support that idea. Often an idea breaks down into natural parts. If you're arguing for something, there's different ways you can support that, right? So your paper might break down the thesis into 3 or 4 ways in which that particular idea is the case. You could also think of it as breaking that thesis into different parts, each of which support it in slightly different ways, but are still part of the argument as a whole. You could also think of your paper as supporting your thesis by giving a particular process where one point leads to the next point, leads to the next point, leads to the thesis. In that case, you're kind of setting up a chain and each of the parts leads to the conclusion. So as you are brainstorming, make sure you can kind of map out the relationship between the ideas and have an understanding of their organization. Keep in mind that the parts of your paper won't be 1 paragraph per part. Some of the parts might be more complex and require 2 or 3 paragraphs to support them. Or you might have an example that supports a point and the example is long enough that it needs to be its own paragraph. So this is mapping out ideas. It is not necessarily mapping out paragraphs. Now it's time to create an outline. Some people struggle to create outlines, and if that's the case, you can just start writing. An outline helps keep you organized and make sure that the ideas are coherent, that everything is relevant, and that the order of ideas makes sense. So it is a good idea to outline before you write. However, you could just jump into the paper and start writing. If that's the case, make sure you give yourself enough time to edit it in depth later. If you just start writing without an outline, it means that you might have to reorganize your paper after you've composed your first draft. I suggest using a reverse outline. If you don't start with an outline, that means that you look at the paper that you wrote, you number each paragraph and look at the main point of each paragraph. And then you think about if they should be reorganized, if some paragraphs are redundant and need to be cut, if maybe some paragraphs need to be combined. And so you reorganize the paper based on the outline you make. Writing a good introduction can be tricky. This is going to be the most important part of your paper in many ways because it gives your main argument or your thesis statement. You want to make sure that your introduction is philosophical. That means that when you set up your thesis, you want to give a hook that gives the particular philosophical issue, concern, or problem in an interesting way that makes your reader want to read your paper. So make sure it's philosophical. Do not give too much historical context. Don't give biographical information about the philosopher. It's really the idea or argument that matters. And so you should be setting up why this idea matters. Then you give your thesis statement. For my classes, I ask students to underline it. That's because 20% of your paper grade is your thesis statement, and I want to make sure that I identify the correct one. If you don't underline it, I am forced to guess which sentence is your thesis statement, and you might not receive the correct credit for it. So make sure you underline it so I can grade your paper fairly. After you state your thesis, your paper's introduction should give a brief overview of how the paper supports the thesis. What are the main steps your paper takes? You don't want to give every single point you're going to put in your paper, just the sort of main supporting points that are going to develop that thesis. This gives your reader an overview so that as they're reading, they can keep track of ideas. When we're writing, we often kind of find our way to an idea, but that's not the same way that we read. When we read, we need to have the main point at the front, and then we see the evidence for it, and it builds that idea up. If you don't have the main point before and you just have a bunch of evidence, we don't know how to connect it as a reader. So if you're struggling to write your introduction, it could be the last paragraph that you write. Start by writing your first paragraph and go through your paper, and then write your introduction at the very end. That can be a good way of making sure that all the important ideas are at the beginning of your paper, instead of accidentally putting all the good ideas in your conclusion, and then your reader has to reread your paper because you don't really get to the point until the end. Make sure that if your conclusion is really strong, that it shouldn't be actually the introduction of the paper. Sometimes it makes sense as you're editing to make your conclusion your intro because it's stronger. As you're writing, keep in keep in your mind the way that paragraphs should be structured. Paragraphs are the building block of your argument, and so it's very important that they are coherent and well organized. They are also like miniature papers in and of themselves because each of them has a main point, supports it, and concludes. So the very first sentence of your paragraph is called the topic sentence. You want to make sure that the first sentence, the topic sentence, gives the main point of the paragraph. And it has to give the main point of that paragraph in a way that clearly supports your paper's thesis, because every single paragraph needs to develop, expand on, and explain your thesis. So make sure in the phrasing you use, it's clear how it's connected back to the main point of your paper. Then after your topic sentence, you need to give supporting evidence for that particular point that is given in your topic sentence. That means you will be paraphrasing relevant passages from the text, giving quotations. And like I said, make sure your quotations are short and pithy. They are full of meaning. They're not just sort of general points or background information, but they're really important philosophical points that you could not say better otherwise. And you could perhaps give an example or a counterexample to flesh out an idea. You also want to make sure that anytime you're paraphrasing or quoting, you're also analyzing and unpacking ideas. Often we do this by drawing connections between points or elaborating on an idea. Then at the end of your paragraph, you want to wrap it up so that we understand how all these points come together and transition into your next paragraph. If you do this, your reader will understand every single sentence of your paper and how it's connected, and they'll follow your argument line by line, which is what is ideal. Your paper is supposed to be doing something like leaving breadcrumbs for your reader. So you want to make sure they're with you at every single point. If you have a huge gap, if you don't leave any breadcrumbs for them, they're going to get lost in your paper. As you are explaining ideas from the text, make sure you analyze them. This could mean evaluating the idea, describing why it matters, what's important, what's significant, what's interesting about that particular idea. Is it distinct from common sense? Is it different than people typically think about that idea? And as you're evaluating, make sure you don't just use adjectives. If you use an adjective like interesting, and you just say it's interesting, the reader has no idea why it's interesting or why you're saying that. So make sure you explain why it's interesting, why it's important, why it's significant in concrete ways. You can also analyze an idea by drawing connections. You can think about how the idea relates to the rest of the philosophical text or to the philosopher's ideas in general. You can think about why this idea is philosophical at all. You can think about its relation to other philosophical ideas that can help us understand it further. You can also develop the idea for yourself by providing more argumentation to support it. You can think about how that claim transforms the way we would typically think about it. If we gain a new perspective by considering it, if there's certain implications for human life that follow from it. Maybe you can think of an example that illustrates this idea and why it's important and how we could apply it to our lives. You can also think about if the idea is still relevant today, in what way is it relevant, or if it would need to be shifted or changed a little bit in order to still be relevant. As you're doing this, I don't want you to use I statements. So in my introductory classes, I tell students, do not use I in papers. This is because I'm trying to get students to start dealing with ideas instead of just giving an opinion on a matter. And so I don't want you to say, I think, or in my opinion, or it seems to be. To me, I want you to think about these ideas and how they could be presented to anyone, not just how you're thinking about them. And so instead of saying, I think this idea is important, you can say, this idea is important because, or instead of saying, I think this is significant, you can say, the significance of this claim is that, and then give the significance. So there's many different ways that we can analyze an idea and signify that we are thinking about that idea and analyzing it for ourselves, but we actually don't need to use I statements to do that. Then you want to write a conclusion where you wrap up ideas by bringing it all together. and reflect on them and their significance. You could leave the reader with something interesting to consider. So just as your introduction kind of gives a hook or sets up the paper in an interesting way, you can reflect on the conclusion in a way that helps your reader to understand why these ideas matter and what sort of note you want to end your paper on. The most important thing is to avoid repetition in your conclusion. Do not just repeat every point you made above. Don't copy things verbatim. Do not copy and paste your thesis statement in the conclusion. I know some professors or high school teachers ask students to do that. I do not think that is a good idea. Do not repeat yourself. Instead, wrap things up in a way that is new and interesting. Don't forget to edit your paper. This is one of the most important things you can do. And even a simple spelling or grammar check just takes about 2-3 minutes per page. And that can make a huge difference in your grade. Since this is a class where we're reading philosophers with different last names from other languages, make sure you're not spelling their names incorrectly. It's very bad if you do not spell the philosopher's name correctly when you're trying to explain their ideas. Look for grammar mistakes. You can use software to check for grammar and spelling mistakes. Look for typos. Make sure that every sentence is clear. Don't have convoluted sentence structure. If it's not clear what the subject or verb of the sentence is, that's a problem. If your meaning is really vague, if your sentence is really sort of too long, you want to simplify things so that your reader can clearly understand what you mean. Also look at the organization of the paper and whether you might need to reorganize some sentences, cut some redundant information or tangents out, or rearrange paragraph orders so that it makes more sense. When you look at each of the paragraphs, make sure they have one topic sentence. The topic sentence, again, is the first sentence of the paragraph that gives the main point of the paragraph in a way that ties back to the thesis statement. So underline the topic sentence. Think about, does it really support your thesis statement? If not, do you need to rephrase it? Do you make a point that's actually similar in another paragraph? Do you need to bring those paragraphs together into one paragraph? So your topic sentences can help you identify where you need to refine points and organization as well. Also look and make sure that you are giving transitional phrases in between ideas. So if you're contrasting two ideas, you use transitional phrases like yet or however. If you are adding points, you say things like moreover. This indicates to the reader how one sentence is connected to the previous one. In the handout I gave you, How to Write a Philosophy Paper, I give you an entire list of transitional phrases you can use to help connect ideas. And then the last thing you need to make sure you're doing is that whenever you give a key term that is used by a philosopher, you make sure to define it. Now, we don't mean definitions from a dictionary. Those are general usage. That's how people generally use those words in any given situation. That's not good enough for philosophy because philosophers are often redefining words. For example, Socrates' definition of wisdom is knowing that you do not know. That is not what it says in the dictionary. So if you use the dictionary to define wisdom for a paper on Socrates, you'd be in trouble. Make sure that you're defining key terms using the text and ideas from the text. And if you're struggling to figure out how to define that term, you can always talk to me and we can talk through it. The interesting thing about philosophy is we spend a lot of time thinking about the words we use. So sometimes you might need to devote an entire paragraph to defining a term like wisdom. If you have any questions about the editing process, you can talk to me. You can also make an appointment at the Writer's Studio. They are all set up to help you revise your paper and make it the best version it can possibly be. Thank you for listening. I hope writing your paper goes well.